I'm with Lubna Chowdhary at her home studio in Streatham, following the opening of her exhibition Erratics at MIMA in Middlesbrough. Lubna, how did you come into ceramics as a medium? Was it a kind of love at first touch, or was it a gradual evolution to get to that point?
What I tried to do with ceramics originally was to avoid it because it had all these, for me, it had these sort of connotations of the domestic. It was a material that was sort of steeped in history and had all sorts of associations with the sort of spiritual and the sensual. And studying ceramics in England meant that it was actually really steeped in British history as well, in the history of studio pottery and the history of the ceramics industry in England. So it's something that I was sort of quite keen to avoid as a material. And I suppose what happened was when I went to university, I studied on a three-dimensional design course, which and the three materials were wood, metal and ceramics. And I had the idea that I wanted to really work with these materials that demanded some sort of construction and I suppose industrial intervention to be able to build with wood and metal, for example. But I realised that I kept being drawn back to ceramics, and I think it was probably because I had very good dexterous skills and there was an immediacy to ceramics that was very appealing because there was this sort of very direct relationship between thinking and making. You could have an idea and very quickly conjure it up using this very organic and responsive material. And so even though I've always had this sort of love-hate relationship, I've ended up sticking with clay over the years, working with it in other forms, you know, in a sort of fired form and using it as an industrial module as well, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that you've got a slightly awkward or uncomfortable relationship, I guess, with like British craft pottery with Bernard Leach and that kind of heritage. But earlier in your career you have collaborated on design projects, you have worked more in what one would think of as the kind of craft and design field. What's your relationship with the world of craft at this point in your career?
I suppose I felt that craft was a very small world, or the community was quite sort of small and quite limited, and that I suppose the wider issues that were being discussed or addressed in the fine art world, for example, like issues of identity or diversity, weren't really being addressed in the craft world. And I think I felt that there was a very sort of singular history of making, which is very, very much about British histories of making, and I really felt that wasn't my history. And I suppose then what I tried to do was to take my skills in making and apply them in a different way. I'd always had this sort of relationship with architecture in the work, and so I took the skills and thought about how to apply them to the built environment and looked specifically at working with tile, because there was a sort of modularity and a rationality to working with tile. There was this sort of adherence to the grid, which was something that I was very interested in. But also the idea of working to commission meant that I was able to sort of circumvent the gatekeepers of the craft world and work in my own way and apply the work that I was making to the built environment in a way that people would be able to experience it without having to go into an art gallery and without having that sort of fear of the institution, and make the work part of people's everyday experience, really. So that was a way of sort of leaving the crafts world but actually continuing to make, and it took the work down into many new I suppose directions of work, in that I was able to start working with industry and industrial processes and develop new communities or develop relationships with people from different communities and work with architects or interior designers or people who commission me to work on their projects. And yeah, and then also I think it also took me away from the quite prevalent plinth-based work that was accepted and expected in the world of craft at the time, and my work had never really fitted those formats. So yeah, I think, you know, just being able to work to scale and apply the work to architecture was a real revelation. Yeah.
Yeah, moving away from the idea of plinth-based works, of course, one of the most remarkable installations of your work that we've seen is the installation of Metropolis at the V&A in 2017. So before we move on to talking about the exhibition Erratics, I'd love to hear a little bit about the Metropolis and how that project started and how it evolved, because it was the work of a couple of decades, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, I suppose the work that I make currently is always about sort of occupying these two very different positions, and as a younger artist I'd really struggled to find some sort of resolution between those and to find an aesthetic language that comfortably resolved my interest in the industrial versus the manual, or, you know, there were many elements, you know, looking at sort of, I suppose, my interest in anthropological collections versus the built environment, and, you know, it was sort of different modes of working and very different sets of references that I had to sort of bring together and try to find some sort of conjunction or some sort of easy relationship between the two. And I really struggled with that, particularly when making larger scale objects. And so I was awarded the Eduardo Palozzi Scholarship when I was at the Royal College, which took me to South India. And when I travelled around for 6 weeks looking at South Indian temple architecture and sort of came back realising that actually I had this sort of inherited culture that I must somehow deal with in the work that I was making. Yeah, so coming back from India, I started to think about how to bring together these two different sets of references. And I started to make very intuitively and work just within the facility of my hands. And I found that that was a really straightforward way of translating and combining these multiple sets of references from, I suppose, the different sort of cultural experiences that I'd had over the years, and combine them in the work without sort of having preconceived thoughts about what I was doing. It was very intuitive and very direct and very immediate. And the work just grew over time, and I treated it almost like a diary of thought, in that I had periods of working on it and then I'd stop for a while and sort of almost come back to it when I had a sort of almost like a new body of thoughts, and just carried on working on it over the years. And it sort of worked a little bit like an anthropological collection, working over different histories and different geographies, yeah, with this sort of real amalgamation of ideas and references.
So for the title of the new show, Erratics, you've taken a term that we associate with geology. So an erratic in geology is a rock that's been picked up by a glacier and it's been moved somewhere far away from its point of origin. And so it's then deposited in a new location, and it's something that's geologically foreign to where it's ended up. What's the kind of overall concept that you started with in imagining this exhibition?
Yeah. I think I got to the point in the work that rather than trying to reach some sort of resolution and to combine multiple references and diverse histories and diverse aesthetics to find some sort of easy mix between the two, I think I'd started to feel more and more comfortable with the idea of making awkward objects that were conjoined in a way, and sort of happier with discarding or disrupting categorization of the work. And so the word erratics, it is all, you know, on the one hand it's this sort of geological phenomenon where something's deposited from one place to another, into a foreign location. And so I felt that in a way, that was a good metaphor for the idea of a diasporic artist who suddenly you're in a new place and you're having to deal with a new culture which you can either adapt or adopt or reject. And you're making those decisions constantly when you're diasporic. You're sort of switching between cultures all the time. And that also described the erratic nature of having to do that throughout your life, but also throughout your art practice. I felt that I was constantly working between, say, for example, the languages of modernism and a minimalist aesthetic, and but then also, I had these innate tendencies to want to sort of ornament things, for example, and work with the language of horror vacui, which means fear of empty space. And then also, to bring in sort of the cultural experiences of my early life and try and find a relationship between the two, not necessarily a sort of smooth, coherent one, something. It could be a relationship that was quite disjointed and sort of dysfunctional in lots of ways. So that's so the term Erratics describes both the process of working that I've sort of adapted over the years, but then also the idea of being a diasporic artist.
So the show includes ceramic works and multi-part tile works, but you've also been working in wood. There's a series of wooden sculptures, which are the titular Erratics, Erratic 1, 2 and 3. And you've, in the past, talked about hybrid objects, and these seem to me to be quite hybrid objects, these wooden sculptures. How did they evolve? Because they're very particular forms. They look a bit like furniture, but they're not functional.
No. Yeah, so these works evolved when I was invited to undertake a residency at the V&A, and I'd gone there particularly with the idea of looking at hybrid objects. I mean, the V&A is a colonial collection, and within the collections there was a series of objects that had been made between cultures. So they were commissioned by Europeans who travelled to India but worked with Indian craftsmen to make larger objects such as furniture which couldn't be transported easily from England. And within these objects I began to recognise this sort of very awkward aesthetic that I felt was really prevalent in my own work, and it was really just this conjunction of different ways of making and different languages, and they also contained, I suppose, different histories of the body, and they were essentially a composite of the two cultures that I had a foot in. I mean, there were awkward furniture-based objects, that really described, I think a lot of them described this sort of difference between floor-based culture versus a sort of more elevated culture, which you'd find in colder climates, for example. But also, there were very particular materials that were used, and there were different histories of sort of ornamentation and decoration coming together in the object. So I felt that this is something that I really wanted to work in, and the idea sort of gestated over time, and eventually when I was offered the Pier Gallery show, I felt that this was something that I was going to explore within the exhibition. So initially I worked again in that sort of very intuitive way where, I just sit down at the desk in the studio and I start making, and I might have sort of particular points of reference. So I might be thinking about different furniture items or the sort of micro-architecture that we might experience in churches or temples, such as confessionals or mihrabs or minbars, or even things like sort of commodes and cupboards and chests at different levels. And so all those references came into the objects that I made. There's a body of work called Disobedient Typologies that is also in the show. And there's some elements of them here. even though they're scaled down, I'm always thinking about the way that there's an engagement with the human body and how human beings would interact with these objects. And then eventually I chose 3 objects to scale up and to actually make them human scale. And so the beginning of the project was that I took a model and a series of drawings and I sent them over to India, and I made contact with the craftsperson there and asked them to translate the drawings and the maquettes into a 1/3 scale object. And this was right at the beginning of COVID, so that did happen. And I suppose what I was interested in was the translations and the slippages and the lack of understanding that might happen within these objects, but without sort of preconceiving anything or without giving specific instructions, but just leaving it to the craftspeople to try and predict what it was that I needed. And what was quite interesting about it was that there were some slippages, because I felt that one of the craftsmen had tried to slightly preempt what a person from the West might want. So my drawings were sort of very pared down, and any sense of decoration was very much reduced, because that's the aesthetic that they'd come to expect from commissions from Europe, for example. So because of COVID, I couldn't continue the project in India, and so I found eventually a maker in Woolwich, and I'd followed his work for a while, and I think what really appealed to me about his work was that there was this combination of industrial, quite sort of technological working with wood as the material, and also a real sort of manual hand finishing and attention to detail. So there's this sort of, I suppose, as there is in a lot of my work, this combination of industrial and manual process. It was something that I recognised in his work, and I felt he'd be an ideal person to work with. And so eventually I handed the project over to him, and the studio was called Jan Hensel Studio, and I felt that the work that they made for me was exactly what I'd asked for. So all that, all those expectations about the sort of translations and the slippages and sort of something lost in interpretation didn't really happen. But I think it's an ongoing project, you know. I've made 3 objects so far, and I suppose the idea is that eventually I can, maybe at the next stage of the project, maybe go back to India or to go to different parts of the world and really think about sort of relationships between cultures and different histories of making, and bringing those together within the objects that I'm commissioning, and end up with a sort of a warehouse full of objects that sort of demonstrate this, I suppose, this confluence of ideas and aesthetics, and the way that things are now much more global. I think when I was looking at the objects at the V&A, there was this sort of real division between the objects. There were 2 very clear and very distinct cultures coming together, and I think that was the case for me when I was a younger artist as well. You know, there was no sort of crossing over from one to the other. Everything was sort of very binary and very categorized, and if you're an artist of Asian origin, then this is where you should be and this is your set of references. And I felt it was very difficult to switch between the 2, whereas now I feel like we're living in, I suppose with technology, we're living in such a global world, and you know, people are so aware of diversity and diverse aesthetics and diverse ways of being that I feel it's no longer such a pertinent issue, and that it's something that I've just got to sort of accept and roll with now. Yeah.
So we're looking at you at the moment standing in front of some of your ceramic tableaux, and these are groupings of forms and patterns that you've developed over years and years. And what's so interesting is that they seem to be familiar, and yet they're obviously original works that you've created. How have you developed your vocabulary of forms, your vocabulary of patterning that you use?
Yeah, okay. I think with the tableau works, what's happened is, I talked earlier about this sort of switch from working in the studio and producing this multi-object work, which is Metropolis, that was this coming together of two very different visual languages and these sort of multiple references across time and across different geographical sort of positions. So there was this very particular aesthetic, of formal aesthetic, that I developed, and then soon after that I'd transferred my way of working and my skills and applied them to the built environment and started to work collaboratively. And I think I explained earlier that really opened up the possibility of working with industrial processes and industrial materials, and also working with tile, which had a real sort of rationality to it. And I really loved the geometry of the grid that was inherent within tile work. But also it allowed me to work, to really develop the language of colour and glaze when I was working on tile, because tile's usually fired flat. So you can sort of work very much more precisely with the glaze. So I ended up eventually with these two very disparate languages, one which was very much about studio practice and working directly with clay as a raw material, and then one which was much more remote, where I'm working with a ceramic object where I've tried to sort of remove all its loaded history from it by paring it down and using an industrial unglazed module, and then just treating it like a sheet material really to cut from, and just using it as a surface to work on with glaze. So it was I had these two very different approaches, and at the V&A residency, as well as the sort of research that I conducted into hybrid objects, I was also very keen to bring together these very disparate parts of my practice and to find some meeting point between the two. And I think quite often when I'm at a point where I'm slightly struggling in the work, I just tend to forget about aesthetic sensibilities or put those to one side, and I start to conjoin ideas and sometimes objects. And so I think what I did with the way that the tableau piece is developed was that I brought these two languages together. So there's a sort of language of form in the works that comes from the Metropolis pieces. So there's this sense of a cityscape almost. There's a definite horizon to the work, and that's a very sort of common element of or a very prevalent element of the Metropolis work, in that it was quite often laid onto the floor, almost like a micro city. But it also incorporates the language of the tile works and the industrial cutting and the precision glazing. So I sort of brought them together and just conjoined the work. And at the beginning, there's always this sort of awkward relationship between the two, but then quite often, the more you just keep pushing it, and then eventually there's some sort of point. You reach a point where where it just begins to work. And I think with these pieces, there was a moment where I was making things and just stacking them up in the studio, and then started to recognise, I suppose, the sort of formal relationship with Metropolis, for example, in the work. And that's something that I've sort of kept pushing, and over the years have brought in, again, sort of very specific references in terms of architecture across different geographies and across different timescapes and histories,
We're also looking at pieces from your work, Grey Area. And this language of the in-between seems to crop up a lot in your works. We've got grey areas, we've got hybrid objects, we've got erratics, and this idea of things that are displaced or things that are somehow two things at the same time, or neither one thing nor the other. And this seems to be a very important theme for you.
It's probably really about this sort of struggle to sort of define yourself. Yeah, I suppose it's about sort of rejecting categorization. Initially, when I was working earlier, it was really about trying to find some middle ground between the two. But life's not like that, you know. I feel that you can't become a person that's in between, like, you know, that is a sort of at a perfect point between two cultures. You're always going to reference one or the other at different times, and I feel that I still do that, both in the work and in life. Yeah, I suppose it's about sort of denying being compartmentalised, which is something that I've had to sort of put up with for so long, and then also just sort of shifting about and not adopting one position and continuing with that. I feel as though over time, you know, I've looked, I mean, we live in such a diverse world, and I feel that I'm constantly looking backwards and forwards from one culture to another, and I suppose slightly, I mean, one of the exhibitions that I had recently was called Code Switch, and there's this real process of code switching between just, yeah, not just between communities, but code switching between aesthetics and ways of making. And yeah, I sort of feel that I want to retain the freedom to be able to do that in the work without really being pinned down to one way of working. I feel like there's so much to look at and think about, and so many different ways to work, so many different ways to work in, that I want to, yeah, just want to try and explore all of those without, yeah, without being limited in any way, yeah.